about your relationship with this work before? Because for me, it feels I've never felt like a book has been more honored by a film. So maybe you could talk about your relationship with the book and how it then came to be what it was.
Yeah, I was offered, or it was suggested that I adapt it. Plan B and Anonymous Content owned the rights, and they gave me a call, and I read it. And in hindsight, I think on the third time, I kind of really understood what it was. The first time, I was reading it and thinking about adaptation, which I would never recommend for any literature. It's just not fair to the work. And then the second time, I think I was able to access it as literature, and then get over, it's like a sensory being, the second time, was able to get over it as literature, and then I think the third time was able to actually get over the not knowing that happened on the second reading, and that twist that is kind of devastating and made me question narratives in general and how daft I am as a reader to be fooled that this was the case. And so, what a beautiful exploration of a very familiar story. And in that, I think it became quite easy to imagine, one, what it was like to look through the eyes of these boys, kind of as myself, but also to imagine that the film could be, or the narrative could be completely stripped to its essence, because everyone knows it, the details are kind of up for grabs, and to populate it with a poetry that doesn't exist in that time period necessarily in photo and film.
I want to talk about, seeing through the eyes of these boys, and maybe just a little bit about the gaze, because I think, you come from documentary and photography, and we talk about these things like the gaze quite a lot in those spaces. How are you thinking about it when you approach this work? And I also want to then bring Jomo in, obviously, when we talk about the cinematography, but what was the intention behind, this gaze that we have throughout the film?
Yeah, I'm glad you bring up gaze. There's like a tendency to center the film on the sort of technical device, when in fact it is about a sort of ontological origin of perception. And the film, I made this film How Kind of This Morning, This Evening, and one thing I learned in that film was that the longer you look at something, the more you actually see it, which sounds like, common sense, but, my best analogy is when you look at words and they kind of collapse over time, and then they build themselves back up, and you're like, what's a letter, whatever, oh, this is a word, that people very rarely, if ever, look at human beings that long, but they look at their family members that long, but they don't look at others that long. And that process of looking, and I say specifically in terms of the quote-unquote black gaze, and specifically in commercial spaces and in the larger zeitgeist, is relatively absent. It exists in small glimpses. I think there's almost nothing more interesting for a person of color to glimpse their subjectivity, referenced or existing somewhere outside of them in any sort of media. It's like mind-blowing. You're like, oh my God, I can't believe that, I'm there. And so, to kind of move on with the answer, the sort of black gaze comes from Toni Morrison in Making Up Kind of This Morning, This Evening. It's like watching some video. It was before I was watching some video where some person asked Toni Morrison when she's going to make films write about white people. And she was like, oh God, that's so confusing of a question. Like, when do you ask a white person when they're doing anything if they're going to do something about a black person or another? And that stuck with me, and I wondered what a version of that was with the camera. Like, how do you reorient what is the othering that the camera does to people of color? How do you reverse it so that white people are the other? And in that, there is no other. Like, we're all the same. It's just that normally, cameras go into the black community. It's not already there. And with that, taking the camera into the body, making it an organ, and elevating the way that, I see the world, the way that Jomo sees the world, into a space that lets everyone participate in it, was the first idea after reading the book, and was developed from there with that in mind.
Jomo, maybe I could bring you in here. As a cinematographer, what is it like to start from that place? Because I also want to get into the practical, technical side of it, but also I guess as a craft, from a poetic sense, what was it like to work for that to be the starting point for you?
Yeah, no, it was incredible. It was incredible because I think that, throughout my career, I've always been trying to imbue images with a certain level of vulnerability, with a certain level of seeing or witnessing of other people. But I think the challenge that RaMell posed to me in making this movie was, as he's already saying, to create an image that you look at the other as if they're your brother, your sister, your mother, your friend, and that's different. And I think that we all know that difference because we know the difference of taking a picture of our mother versus taking a picture of anyone else on earth. There is a connection that's there. You see them as an infinite being, even in this like momentary kind of collapse. So in this movie, kind of, as the camera is going and whoever's operating the camera, whether it's RaMell, whether it's me or our operator, Sam Ellison, when Anjanou Ellis hugs the camera, she's hugging us physically. And I think that changes because when you're now imbuing this camera with a gaze, with a person's consciousness, with the way a person moves through space and creates meaning, all of a sudden you're not operating as Jomo or Sam or RaMell, you're operating as Elwood or Turner. So all of a sudden when that hug happens, you are being hugged by your grandmother. And then when you separate, you are looking at your grandmother. You frame that completely differently. And I think that this movie kind of had an experience as an image maker that was so fundamentally different from everything else that I think that naturally cinema, when we watch as viewers and see the image, there's a membrane there, kind of that naturally, creates a process of dissociation. Of course it would. And that's fine. There have been great movies that were created even with that aspect of the conceit of cinema. And I think that for this film, our hope was to just puncture that membrane a little bit, to create a gap, a space, a gateway for hopefully a more subjective and then kind of emotional connection with the character, with the story, with the people and their real lives. And I think that also happens when you operate. I think that also happens when you create images. I'll say for myself where there's a membrane because I'm looking at the actor, I'm looking at the character, and at some level they are a subject and I'm hoping to capture the fullness of their emotions, but I am in the privileged position of being from the outside looking in. In this movie, I never had that safety. We were shooting from inside the scene, and so when things happened, we had to kind of live and breathe with it. We had to truly be vulnerable when we were shooting the scenes in a totally different way where, the actor became our scene partner and not just someone that we were creating images around.
No, thank you. And I think that difference that you're describing in the way of making it, I think we feel as an audience. There's such a tenderness and a care, and it's quite disorientating. But once you kind of give yourself to that invitation to become sort of more part of the film than you usually are, it's really an extraordinary experience to watch, and it's been one of the most remarkable films for me this year for that reason. I'm going to open up in a second. I just wanted to ask again, on a technical, practical sense. I think thinking about gaze, you obviously, the way that you're operating these cameras, you're trying to replicate how people look at people, how people see and move around. What did you have to kind of take into consideration in that space? Because I think it could feel quite, clunky. But it feels very natural. There's like a poetry to it. Maybe you could talk a bit about creating that looking movement with the camera. Either one of you, both of you.
I think that for RaMell and I, this movie ideally wanted to try to create an image that doesn't replicate sight, but replicates what sight feels like, what memory feels like, what meaning creation feels like. So, that was kind of that was one of the aspects of why we chose the narrow aspect ratio, why we shot primarily with normal to telephoto lenses, was to create in the cinematic experience both boys creating meaning, seeing this, then seeing that, then seeing this other thing, and how do they then create? Is this space safe? Is it not safe? Is this a friend? Is this not a friend? Of like, how do we create meaning? How does our brain create understanding of space? And yeah, I think that towards that, it was always trying to, like, RaMell and I very quickly, kind of in talking in prep, kind of stopped using the term point of view. And we started saying that what we were looking for was to try to create a sentient image, an image that takes place inside the scene, an image that can be affected by the people and the world that it's in, an image that is navigating an oftentimes hostile environment. But yeah, towards that, it was really kind of, every scene we planned as a oneer, knowing we were going to cut, but knowing that the camera language invited a level of artifice to the actors, so we wanted, as soon as they started the scene, to be able to go all the way to the end of the scene, which meant that it was using some insane camera systems for each scene, because whatever we used, whatever apparatus, had to last us the entire action of the scene. So yeah, towards that, we just talked and talked and talked and talked. We wrote a shot list, so every pan, tilt, motion you see in the movie was something that we premeditated kind of months before shooting. Quite literally everything was orchestrated at that level, with almost the approach being that it was, in a way, kind of trying to create music or trying to create something like jazz, where it's like, people think about jazz as improvisation, but actually jazz is improvisation within an incredibly rigid structure that is a musical element, where it's like it has melody and then it has aspects of improvisation within it. So towards that, kind of our approach was coming to set every day with a meticulously built plan, so that if an actor did something different, if something new happened, or if we just wanted to change up each shot so that they felt like a sense of wonderment, felt like a sense of discovery each shot, it was almost like we had the tracks laid, we can jump off the tracks, have a solo, jump and click back into the track and kind of continue on. So yeah, it was really just building a meticulous shot list, and also just a lot of camera testing. RaMell and I had a small DSLR, and while we were shot listing, we would just be like, okay, let's try hugging. Like, does that work? Like, no, that looks terrible. Okay, well, why don't we try this, where we come up and then down and then move the focus to the background? Maybe that'll feel more like an embrace and not like you're staring at a shoulder or something. So it was, these kind of just testing a lot of things, because there's a way in which, all of us are hyper literate with this perspective. We live inside of our own bodies and see the world from this view our entire lives. So there's a way in which, if something's even a centimeter off, it feels uncanny and it feels weird and hard to see. And then, you fiddle with it, and then ideally it feels free floating and lyrical. But, the actual shooting of it was surprisingly meticulous and kind of organized and orchestrated.
I lied. I have one more question before I open it up, because I really want to talk about these archival interventions in the narrative. I feel, however much we get lost in the story, I think you're constantly reminding us that this is truth. This happened to real people. Yeah, maybe you could talk about incorporating that into this, this narrative, the wider narrative of the story.
Yeah, I think. I know the archival imagery is tied into the looking that happens in this film and looking that has kind of happened across cinema in general. There's something that I've been mulling over for a long time, and it seems dense, but I don't think it really is. It's like that cinema has left photography, that it just skipped photography. So we have, the image comes into the world, and it's like the most visceral, reality-producing thing ever. People think that their souls are being taken. It's so, and it's a daguerreotype. Like, we're talking 10 types. We're talking stuff that's 30-second exposures, 11-second exposures, whatever. And it has a very specific temporal structure, a photograph. And you think about what photographs do, which is they create all the meaning possible into one frame. That's what they do. They try to do as much as possible. Obviously, there are photo books where you're putting stuff and you're juxtaposing, but it's pretty static. And then you have cinema that immediately became obsessed with narrative once the image came out. But we never dealt with the complexity of photography as an intervention into human memory or as a relation, or its relationship to intensifying objectification, to squishing and creating perspectives in the world, the visual field that don't exist otherwise. I love to quote Stephen Shore in that he's like, photography is monocular, right? Human beings are binocular. Like, if you can take a photo, I can take a photo of you, ma'am, and the person behind you, and I can make it seem like, you are coming out of that person's head. That relationship does not exist in the real world. It only exists because of photography. And that way of making relationships that don't exist is the way in which we've replaced the perception of our cultures and replaced the interactions and perceptions of being with people who aren't in our direct community, who aren't our family members. And that process has produced, the ink being spilled type of lies that could never be figured out, And with thinking about, one, the way that the film is shot sort of photographically, cinemagraphically, in that we start with photographs, we end with photographs. Every stop is a photograph. It's trying to reproduce that temporal space, but have it be carrying consciousness in the way in which cinema can do. You have to think about the way that the archive has, I like to say people die in the archive. We think that photography gives life. I think, and many other people who have written about this, from Walter Benjamin to, Eduardo Cadava, and many others, that photography is actually death. Because it produces a version of you that has never existed, that dies, and is in the minds of others, whatever. So, sorry. Yeah, it's just so dense. I'm trying to, just make it seem, just trying to not have you all fall asleep. Like, my guy here is like, I can't. I'm in the middle. I would leave, but I'm in the middle. I'm just kidding. So with the archive, it's a place in which specifically people of color were never represented authentically as family members. 99% of all images across the world of people of color have been made by white people. What does that mean? What does that mean for the way in which we see ourselves? We are programmed to see ourselves in the way in which others have seen us. Really complicated. So can you go to the archive and rescue people? Can you go to the archive and find these moments in which, like my favorite example, because there's like, the film's really dense. I'd love for you guys to watch it again. Because I think on the third time, and I say this genuinely, like you'll be able to see it, but there's like a lot going on, as I'm sure you imagine. Like the moment that Turner goes under and he's like swimming towards Elwood's legs, right? Elwood has these scars on his legs, and Turner's like reaching up to touch it. And then when we cut, there's this girl on the left that's like looking at the camera like this, right? When I saw that in the archive, like in the moment that was presented, it was like, oh, I see you, finally. Like I'd seen after this and before this, and now I see you. And now that we see you, let's bring you into this new archive to kind of give you life. And with that, you're allowed to see the relationship between the camera, as Jomo and I have shot this film, and the way in which the camera has presented people otherwise. What happens when you get people who have been thinking about these things, resources, and there's a poetry and a timeline between the production of blackness and the camera that happens there. But also, we are giving life to the Dozier School boys too. Like, I think the initial archival impulse came from looking at the Dozier School document and seeing the images of the portraits of those boys, and you're like, we're going to be making images this whole film. One, why does fantasy fiction film not use images other than the ones that they're creating? First, weird question. Second is there's nothing more powerful than this. There's nothing that we're going to do that is actually more powerful than this document of this person who had this happen to them. So that must be in the film, and that kind of opened it up.
And I think one of the reasons why it feels like you've honored the book is I've heard Colson Whitehead talk about that same thing of really wanting to make sure that the truth came through in the book because it's real stories. And we feel that in his writing the same way we felt in the film. We are running out of time, but I'm going to open up to the
I'm sorry.
If I could ask for questions.
This have to be, if
Short
you say
questions.
this will make it good. This have to be the best question. And then no one's going to be like, so remember when I was 8 and I saw a movie.
Who's feeling brave? Here we go at the front. Have we got the mic? Yeah, it's coming back. Throw mic.
Yeah, I got it. Just like flip it up. He'd catch it too.
Great film. Thank you for this film.
I had a question about point of view. What you said, I'm currently in film school, and they preach point of view all the time, not switching point of view, telling the film through one character so you keep the emotional impact of the scene. Were you ever concerned at all or pressured to go against your impulse for point of view out of the fear that it could come off as more of as they call in film school, a camera trick, more so than the emotional impact that you want from us from the film? Was that ever a concern for you?
No, not a concern for me because I didn't go to film school. I'm a self-taught photographer that went to grad school for photography. They didn't teach us about photography. We just had conversations with our peers, and then we were able to find scholars at parallel universities, thesis committees, and we could expand our language. And so the rules of cinema, I've never thought of them. I'm not interested in them. I'm interested in making work that speaks to our experience and to the way that we're in our bodies, the way that we understand cinema to be. Which is a blessing that I came to art school and I'm like, all these people studied art, I'm so behind, and then you see their work and you're like, damn. I'm happy I'm behind, In fact, I'm going the other way, And so, yeah, it's a great starting point. If you all haven't seen Hell County this morning, this evening, and I only say this because, yeah, please, it's a film that I made otherwise, but it was Jomo and I's main source of, we had our films, Ida, Hard to Be a God, Tree of Life, The Mirror, but we went back there because that's something that we recognized, and that's what we wanted to build from, and the point of view is kind of emerges from that practice. And so I would say, I think maybe the best part about this film is that it should just show that the stuff that you're learning comes from Western logic, And one of my favorite armchair theories that I haven't developed is what does a polytheistic lens look like? What is a lens that's born in another culture's zeitgeist? Western logic is Christian. There's something about the camera that others. There's something about Christianity. And I grew up going to church, so it's not a knock against it. But God's up in the sky. God is out there. God is not. He's other than you, and you are going to get to Him eventually. But in Buddhism, everything is God. This is God. We are God. It's what those underpinnings of the camera, the underpinnings of the institution, the underpinnings of the industry produce something that is what we see normally.
Also, I would just add on to that cinema is only 130 years old. It can't possibly think it understands itself at any level enough to have rules. We have patterns. We have prescriptions. We do not have rules for cinema. Painting is thousands of years old, and we still have not understood it. So I think that sometimes cinema and filmmakers get really trapped in this idea that, the 180-degree rule. The 180-degree rule exists because we had proscenium theater, and that was an easy way to understand body placement as it relates to a singular viewer. Actually, everything, we are in the heyday of cinema. We are in the point where truly we are making the rules. We do not follow rules on how cinema goes. Or that's kind of how I like to think about it, where it's if something is emotional or is evocative for me, that means it works. And I think that I kind of buck against when people tell me there is a prescriptive way in which we're doing this, because there have only been literally maybe 6 generations of people who have ever made movies. That is not enough case studies to ever think that we know what we're doing here. And that's the fun of exactly where we are in our art form right now.
Mm-hmm. And I had the challenge is to smuggle these ideas into commercial cinema. That's the hard part. The easy part is to do it in the art context, which I do, and we do, love it. It's awesome, but to get them to these theaters for everyone to see, that's the challenge.
Thank you. I'm so sorry for running out of time. But I think that's actually a really beautiful.
So fast.
It's a really beautiful way to end, especially for all the filmmakers in the room. And I know there's lots because we work with them. But thank you so much, RaMell, Jomo, for being here. Thank you, everyone, for coming. And the film is in cinemas next year, so tell your friends if you like it. Thanks again, guys.
No, I can't believe you guys got to see it in IMAX. That's crazy. Yeah. We haven't even seen it in IMAX. What's going on?